Hey everyone, DM Xavier here. If you're enjoying the content on this channel, please click the like button below, subscribe, share, and don't forget to click the bell icon to ensure you get notifications as soon as I upload new content. Without further ado, the finale. Let's begin. The group sat in total silence for what felt like an eternity, overlooking the edge of the massive open shaft that sat before them. You know, once we go down there, we have to push hard until we've found the kids. Now that we know they've been whisked away to some twisted druid down there, we know what we need to do, and I don't think it'll end peacefully, Droven said. The rest of the group nodded. Gash lurched forward and twisted around, bracing herself and testing the vines.
Feels alright to me. Let's finish this,
she said with an exhausted smirk. Everyone began to slowly descend the 80-foot straight drop into the room below. When they arrived, luminescent fungus clung to the walls and ceiling, shedding violet light. The air was damp, chilly, and redolent of the odors of loam and decay. A layer of earth mixed with rotting vegetation and the remains of cave animals covered the floor of the wide cavern. Several varieties of mushrooms and fungi grew on the detritus as well as a few saplings. Two gaunt, cloaked figures busily shoveled the well-turned earth into a rusted wheelbarrow. Within the confines of the compost-laden room stood a single wooden door along the southern wall, another along the eastern wall, and a crude opening that had been torn in the northern wall. Gash threw a hand up when the rest of the party reached the bottom.
Bone men,
she said, pointing at the gaunt figures.
And tree people,
she said again, pointing at the saplings that sat rooted in the ground nearby. Droven quietly snapped his fingers and pointed south. The group began to move. They reached the door and hurriedly opened it, stepping into a 40-foot-long, 10-foot-wide hallway and closing the door behind them. Droven spoke up. It's best to not fight what we don't have to. At least not yet. We can head south for now and figure out what needs to be done with them on the way out. The group reached the end of the hall and realized that the tunnel was interrupted by some sort of past geologic violence that bent the earth. The tunnel continued past the rift, though it had shifted about 10 feet to the west. They pushed on, heading south and bypassing the continuation of the hallway until they reached a widening in the rift that created a stone antechamber. Small, 1-foot diameter holes riddled the node. A fiery light emanated from one of the holes. Fenton crouched and picked up a pinch of blackened soot from around one of the holes before bringing it to his nose and inhaling. Nope, he said. We need to find another way. These holes were made by a Thokwa. It's a fire-based elemental worm about 5 feet long with a temper to match the heat its body produces. We don't want to disturb it, trust me. Breeses pointed further up the rift, back the way they'd come. If my sense of direction is correct, we should be better off that way. It's below the first floor of the ruins. The group nodded and began their trek northeast, through the rift in the earth, until they reached what appeared to be a partially crumbled stone wall that led to a darkened and empty cell. The rotting wooden door stood partially ajar, revealing a dim light in the room ahead. The group entered and could hear clear as day the sound of shouting, arguing, laughing, and fighting goblins from the room beyond the door. Droven looked the group over quickly before telling them, "It's going to get violent in there. Be on your guard for any of them attempting to escape, and draw them to me if you can." They all nodded and prepared themselves, drawing weapons and stepping up to the door behind Droven. With a quick shove from his shoulder, the door swung open, revealing a set of 2 rows of dragon-carved marble columns that marched the length of the hall, though most were smothered in luminescent fungi. The cobblestone floors cracked and stained with much use, and held many small wooden tables. Table contents included mortars and pestles, bowls filled with crushed leaves, chopped fungus stalks, and other plant specimens. The many doors leading off of this hall were all partly opened, and goblinoid sounds were audible from beyond them. Droven quickly entered the room and peered around, noting the other 5 doors along the hall and a single additional door leading to the west. He motioned for the group to spread out as he approached the door closest to them on the southern wall. Breesus and Heskin took to the center of the room and began looking through the tables, while Gash and Fenton took to the far west of the room to do the same. Droven put an eye to the opening of the door and found a single, massive dire rat strapped spread eagle onto a wooden bench in the room's center. Large, woody, fruit-like tumors riddled the creature's body. 2 goblins stood over it, poking and prodding the tumors with crude scalpels and spikes, causing the occasional yelp. Droven threw the door open, weapons in hand. He dashed in and thrust quickly with his rapier, impaling the closest goblin with its tip. He withdrew quickly and took a wild slash, cutting a gash across the side of its head. Regardless of the trauma, the goblin still stood, now screaming out in shock and pain as its counterpart stood wide-eyed at the sudden and violent assault. The rest of the group barely had time to draw weapons before the remainder of the goblin squad was upon them. The northern door closest to the western wall opened, and a barrage of arrows loosed from crude goblin shortbows rained down on Fenton, catching him twice, once in the left arm and a second to the side of the head, sending him crumpling to the ground in a twitching heap. Gash grabbed the collar of his shirt and began to drag him to the center of the hall where she, Heskin, and Breesus formed a defensive triangle while Droven battled in the room to the south. Heskin chanted out a single word of power, bringing Fenton back from the brink just as the center door on the northern wall opened, revealing another 2 goblins. Both cocked an arm back and hurled javelins at the group. One struck Fenton again, sending him back into unconsciousness. The second hit Heskin hard in the chest, forcing him to take a knee. From the room to the west of Droven, another 2 goblins appeared, both holding crude short swords and shields, while the other 4 peppered the group with arrows and javelins. The 2 bravest, or stupidest, charged forward, swinging wildly at Gash. Gash had taken 2 arrows and a javelin at this point, and was on the verge of blackout when they arrived, cutting wildly at her legs. She swung down hard, splitting the skull of the first assailant, which sent it into a heap on the ground. The second landed a lucky blow straight into her kneecap, which sent her flailing onto the ground. Breesus and Heskin stood shoulder to shoulder. Breesus fired an arrow, hitting the goblin nearest Gash in the throat. It screamed and gurgled at the same time, creating a sickening series of bubbles to erupt from its throat and mouth before hitting the ground. Another javelin and arrow struck Heskin before the goblins ran out of ammunition. Heskin struggled to heal himself. He instinctually took a knee before the remaining 4 goblins were upon him, stabbing wildly at his head and neck. Breesus split from the group and shouted, "Droven, help! They've killed everyone! They're killing everyone!" Her pleas were cut short by the advancing group of clever goblins who'd managed to surround her, all 3 lunging at the same time and running her abdomen through with their blades. Droven swung again with his short sword, finishing the last of the 2 goblins in the room with him. Time slowed momentarily as he glanced into the main hall from the corner of his eyes, catching the bloody heap of his companions on the ground in the throes of a death rattle. His brain shut down, and his instinct took over. In one swift motion, he turned on his heels and lunged out of the room and into the main hall, taking a defensive stance in the center of his dying friends. The goblins took the bait and charged. Droven took a deep breath and focused, watching every moment of the 4 small goblinoids as they rushed forward. He leaned back on his left heel, feinting slightly and lunging at the first, catching it just above the 3rd rib on the left side, impaling its heart. As it hit the ground, he spun in a full circle, taking a glancing blow to the calf in the process, and coming down with a hard slash on the now off-balance creature with his short sword, cutting its throat so deeply he could see its spine. As the final 2 goblins began to lunge, Droven internalized his combat prowess and forced a burst of adrenaline to surge through his body. As the wave began to erupt, so too did the next flurry of attacks. His rapier caught the first goblin in the shoulder. He withdrew quickly and parried a short sword meant for his bowels, riposting and catching it under the jaw. It screamed and hit the ground. Glancing to the left, he knelt and allowed the goblin within his defensive stance. With a quick pommel strike to the stomach, the goblin heaved forward, impaling its own head on the tip of his short sword in the process. Droven then lunged, throwing all of his weight into the creature, forcing himself on top of it, all the while driving the blade of his sword through the back of its skull. As the adrenaline faded, Droven reclaimed his mind from primal instinct. Panting, he quickly sheathed his weapons and withdrew a healing potion from his pouch. He fed it to Heskin, whose eyes flickered open warily. "Quick, you've got to heal the others, they're all dying," he said. Heskin jolted up and internalized his magic. He clutched his holy symbol while he prayed. His body burst like a beacon of light as a wave of healing energy rolled out from his being, sending hundreds of motes of energy into his companions, healing some of their wounds and bringing them all back from the brink of death. Everyone came to slowly and looked around at the carnage around them. "How the hell did that happen?" Bresis asked as she stood to her feet. "We almost fell to less than a dozen goblins?" Fenton blinked hard as he popped a good berry into his mouth. This was their turf. I don't think we realized just how many of them there were. I thank the heavens Droven was able to defeat them. Droven glanced down at the Druid. I had no choice. It was either fight or die trying at that point. I'm tired now. Unfortunately, we need to move on. Let's go. The group searched the remaining rooms, looting a decent handful of coin and enough arrows to fill Bresis' quiver in the northern room along the eastern wall. Fenton leaned over the dire rat who suffered in the chamber Droven had initiated combat in. "Rest easy now, brother. I'm sorry they've tortured you like this." With that, he drew his blade across the beast's throat and turned to walk away. The group gathered in the northeastern room, which housed another door leading east. Gash pushed Droven aside, who now appeared slightly sluggish after his feat in combat. Gash pushed the door open and peered inside. Nodules of luminescent fungus hung from the ceiling and walls, and grew in clumps upon the floor. The vaguely nauseous light illuminated portions of grand bas-relief carvings on the stone walls that were not covered with the same fungus. The carvings all consisted of dragons in various stages of raining fire down upon terrified humans, elves, dwarves, and other people. Soil and compost covered half of the floor of the chamber, which allowed a variety of wan grasses to grow. A bench containing simple gardening implements stood along the western wall. To the far south of the room, a single goblinoid standing easily 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, covered head to toe in thick brown fur, tended to a makeshift garden. Gash put a hand up and pointed at the door just north of them, nodding obnoxiously. She then pointed to the south and shook her head vigorously. The group pushed past the door and crept quietly into the next chamber. The northern chamber looked almost identical to the southern chamber, except that it was home to a door on the eastern wall, set into an awkwardly shaped alcove, and a northern door, both of which stood closed. Gash approached and opened the door to the east. Luminescent mist blurred the edges of the octagonal chamber. Nodules of glowing fungi dotted both the stone walls and ceiling, as well as the caps of toadstools and mushrooms, small polyps, puffballs, lichens, and less identifiable growths. The air was humid and reeked of rot. 3 skeletons, dressed in decomposing brown sacks, gently tilled the compost in this room. Gash's eyes went wide.
Uh-oh. Bone men! Get 'em!
She shouted as she charged forward, spinning her axe in the process, and coming down on one of the undead tillers. She made contact, and with little effort, sent its bones scattering into the soil. The second skeleton reared back with its rusted hoe and swung down at Gash. She parried the blow as Heskin stepped around the left side of her with his mace in full swing. He swung true and destroyed the skull of the skeleton, causing its necromantic magic to fade, sending it into a heap on the ground. Fenton approached the third, to the right of Gash, and with an uppercut-like move with his staff, caught the skeleton in the ribcage. The magic of his shillelagh burst, and the skeleton detonated from the inside, turning it to dust. The three breathed heavily as the sound of a door bursting open rang out from the chamber prior. Breesis yelped from the room, looking north. "Oh shit, bugbear! Help me!" she shouted as she drew a crude harvesting sickle from her side, just in time to block the brunt of the bugbear's heavy, two-handed swing, causing her to hit the floor, but avoiding the full force of the mace's spiked head. Droven thrust up with his rapier, catching it in the shoulder. He withdrew and thrust up with a flourish, stabbing just below the beast's left pectoral muscle. It roared in pain and used its weight to swing upward quickly, hitting Droven square in the stomach, which caused him to bounce off the wall behind him. Gash charged the bugbear, still enraged from her assault on the undead. She lashed out at it, cutting it twice with her axe and causing it to stagger ever so slightly. Breesis saw the opening and rolled to her left. She sat up and drew a quick slash across the rear of the monster's heel, causing the tendon to snap and its entire body to hit the ground. Heskin approached and with a single blow to the back of the head sent the creature to meet its maker. The group took a moment to readjust themselves and patch their wounds as much as they could with what little resources they had at their disposal. "I've only got a couple of spells left in me today," Heskin said. "Same here. My magic can't manifest much more, so I'll have to resort to being beautiful and inspiring." Breesis chuckled. Fenton thought for a moment. "If I need to, I can shapeshift again, and I have a bit of magic at my disposal, but not much. Hopefully, we can get to the kids quickly and identify the source of this damned fruit in the process." The group then headed north through the door where the bugbear had appeared and entered another fungus-laden octagonal room with a set of stone stairs, crumbled and dampened from years of abuse, that descended sharply to both the east and west. "East. Keep your eyes and ears peeled. The moisture in the air is getting thicker. We've got to be close," Droven said. They then carefully descended the stairs and took up a single-file formation as the tiny underpass grew short and narrow. They rounded a sharp turn almost immediately and began a silent walk down a 120-foot-long hallway. Near the end, a door stood against the eastern wall, being held up by two crumbling pillars and equally disheveled walls surrounding it. Droven listened at the door before motioning to the group. A layer of soil covered the floor in this 15 by 25-foot room. Rough wooden shelves filled with a scattering of tomes and scrolls lined the northern and eastern walls, while a rough-hewn desk stood in the center of the chamber. Fungus on the ceiling provided light, apparently in sufficient quantity to nourish the several small bushes and pale saplings that grew in the soil. The group immediately began digging through the tomes, searching for anything of use. During the search, Heskin uncovered two scrolls, one holding an incantation for the Entangle spell, and another for the Slow Poison spell. Fenton called to the group, picking up a massive, white bark-bound tome from a small desk. "This is written in Druidic," he said as he flipped through its pages. His finger stopped suddenly on a page holding the sketch of a deflated-looking apple. "I'll be a son of a bitch," he said in amazement. "It says here that this druid was commissioned by cultists of Nerul to feed a magical tree the blood of humanoids over the course of the last few years in order to provoke it into growing a blood apple or midwinter fruit. He succeeded, and the fruit was harvested and sent north with the cultists. It says here he's been commissioned to produce 8 more over the course of the next 8 winter seasons." Heskin's face sank. "Well, I think that answers a few questions. These cultists wanted the fruit for something. We need to find this tree and burn it to the ground. If the druid attacks, which he most likely will, we must End him, he said. The group nodded and pushed forward to the door that stood against the southern wall of the Druid's study. Droven again put an ear to the door to listen. Goblins, he said. They're not fighting, though. It sounds like they're counting. Be ready. Hit them hard and fast. With that, he thrust the door open. 4 goblins sat in the open room, sorting twig and root piles. The collapsed southern wall opened into a vast cavern. Pustules of luminescent fungus on the rough walls and high roof loomed over a twilight grove of sickly briars, bushes, saplings, and other woody plants. Ruined walls and hollow towers protruded from the briars like islands in the sea. The goblins looked up in complete horror as the door opened, clearly not expecting the group. Each dropped their respective materials and drew old short swords before rushing forward. Droven was already on one with Gash in tow, axe already in mid-swing before an arrow whizzed past her face, striking a goblin in the chest, which sent it falling backward. Gash and Droven worked their assailants over before the final goblin, who sat furthest from the door, stood up and sprinted full bore into the grove of briars to the south. It then did the one thing nobody wanted it to do. It screamed out in Goblin at the top of its tiny lungs, sending its voice bouncing from wall to wall. As the final 2 goblins fell, Heskin incanted as softly as he could, bringing his mace up and sending a burst of divine energy screeching into the southern chamber, where it struck the goblin in the back of the head, forcing it to fall forward into the dirt. Everything fell silent for a moment. Fenton's ears perked up. He tilted his head ever so slightly before exhaling loudly. "It's time. Move!" he shouted to the group as he broke into a full-bore sprint south, entering the thick of the grove. Pale, spindly briars coated with tiny barbs pressed close as the group moved. The violet light above cast a nauseating series of shadows on the earthen floor, creating the illusion of movement among the branches, though no wind blew here. As they sprinted, Gash shouted out in pain,
"No! The branches are alive! Run! Run!"
she yelled, swinging down and cleaving an animated twig creature, much like they'd seen in the Hobgoblin leader's throne room above, in two. "Holy shit, they're everywhere!" Droven shouted, trying to keep his footing while following Fenton's lead. As the 250-foot-long sprint came to an end, a courtyard wall of heavy stones created a half-walled clearing among the briars. Several varieties of plants grew around the perimeter, including a few suspicious-looking saplings, but their importance paled before that which stood at the center of the courtyard. Beneath the venomous fungal light grew a singular tree of evil. Its blackened, twisted limbs reached upward like a skeletal hand clawing its way from the earth. Human figures stood near the tree, a woman holding what was clearly a large tome, and 2 men. One dressed in elaborate scale mail, with a holy symbol of Pelor emblazoned upon his shield, and the other who wore a simple brown cassock and a sickle. A 3-foot-long tree frog sat next to the man in brown. The skin of the 2 more elaborately dressed individuals appeared dull, brown in color, and textured like aged wood. Fenton didn't stop when he approached. Instead, he lurched forward, hitting the ground hard, his body cracking and shifting as he took on the form of a giant wolf spider. He turned, reared back, and lunged at the giant tree frog, who saw his assailant incoming and instinctively leapt over him, sticking to the side of one of the crumbling walls. From behind the group, a horde of twig blights appeared and flanked them, cutting them off from any easy escape. Droven charged in, thrusting at the paladin. Clearly Sir Bradford, though changed in some way, his eyes glazed over as he fought with puppet-like instinct. The 2 began a heated melee. The female flipped her tome open and began an incantation. Her palm outstretched, and a barrage of 3 pink missiles materialized and streaked forward, striking Gash regardless of her attempts to dodge, leaving small, sizzling skin spots on her shoulders. Bresis and Heskin turned to face the Blight horde. Bresis rushed forward, breathing in Heskin at her side. She flashed a series of arcane gestures and exhaled with a yodel that burst like thunder, destroying 3 of the plant creatures in the process. Heskin reared back, taking a scrape to the leg but swinging down with his mace, shattering another in the process. The scrape sent a burning sensation rocketing up his leg before hitting his abdomen and dissolving. "Watch yourselves. The plant creatures have poisonous thorns," he shouted to the rest of the group. The dark druid's eyes grew black before igniting with unnatural fire. He threw both hands out and focused on Heskin, pointing a twisted finger at him and chanting a slur of incantations that caused his chain shirt to heat up like a hot coal. His scales sizzled as he looked down, the chains turning red as he watched and screamed. Gash glanced back and then forward, rushing at the druid while screaming in anger. She swung down hard on the druid, cutting a deep gash along his face and shoulder. Thankfully, she also cut the concentration he maintained on his spell, causing Heskin's armor to cool down quickly. Gash swung again, this time catching him hard in the chest and sending him to the ground. Bresis breathed deeply again and expended the final bit of her magic to incant a final thunderous wave, blowing another 3 of the twig blights out of existence. By this time, Fenton had landed a lucky blow on the frog with his web, tangling it up the more it struggled. He pounced, digging his fangs into the frog's soft flesh, injecting as much poison as he could before the poor beast fell still. Droven and Sir Bradford continued to go blow for blow, making little in the way of progress in either direction. It was clear that Droven was tired, however, as his ability to parry and riposte had all but vanished. Heskin poured the final drops of his own magic into healing for himself, as another series of 3 magic missiles pounded him in the chest, drawing blood from the freshly stitched scales. The outcast druid rolled out of the way, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Gash came down hard, missing him by inches. With an unnatural grace, he leapt to his feet and swung up with his sickle, catching Gash in the jaw like a fish who'd just been snagged. Gash grabbed the man's arm and bent it backward, forcing the elbow to bend out of place before it audibly snapped. He screamed and let go of the sickle. Gash yanked the blade from her jaw and came down on the man with a single blow to the side of the head that made the crescent moon shape disappear, leaving nothing more than a hilt in his skull. As his body hit the ground, Sir Bradford and the woman with the tome went completely limp, each of them hitting the ground in unison. Confused, the remainder of the group turned and bolted to Bresis' side, where they cut down the remaining 6 twig blights with ease. As they turned, the dark tree in the room's center shifted slightly. Heskin rushed to the 2 humans and looked them over. "They're alive," he said. "I can't believe it. They look very sick. We need to go. Now," he said as he began to hoist the female up. Gash grabbed the man without an issue and made for the exit. "Wait!" Droven shouted. "We have to set that tree ablaze. There's no way we're leaving it for the cultists to get a hold of." He took a knee and unslung his backpack, removing a torch and lighting it quickly with a tinder twig. Fenton reverted to his natural form, and with a flick of his wrist and an elemental incantation which sounded like crackling campfire, he conjured a large, living ball of fire which he projected forward, manipulating its movement with wide, oversized arm gestures. Droven tossed his torch into the limbs of the tree. With an ear-piercing wail, the tree shuddered and bent as if it were living. The flames of the torch and the flaming sphere licked wildly up the tree. The group then turned and began to flee while a thick smoke grew heavy in the air. Not a single one stopped to turn back. 35 minutes went by before the group reached the ravine. Heskin prayed over the two unconscious forms, begging Bahamut to spare them from death until he could get them to a healer with enough magic to help them. As they reached the top of the cliff, Fenton allowed his form to shift once more, transforming into the familiar brown furred draft horse. Heskin and Droven slung the bodies over its back, and Heskin mounted to continue his prayers. "Meet us back in town. I'm taking them to Corky," Heskin said to the rest of the group.
Go!
Gash shouted as she slapped the horse's ass. With that, Fenton rode hard for Bree. 2 days of rest and relaxation had gone by. The group collected their earnings after paying a visit to Mayor Vunor, and Fenton had received a letter via Raven, stating that he was being summoned to visit his circle, where he'd be expected to undertake the Dream. He explained that the Dream was a physical trip into the Feywild, where young druids go to master their shape-shifting ability. Undertaking this endeavor was taxing on a person's being, and required another to act as a tether to the prime material plane. Gash volunteered to act as his tether, seeing the good in what he could learn. As the group set off, paying their final respects to Mayor Vunor, and wishing his only remaining child, and Sir Bradford alike, a swift recovery, a message came over the minds of Heskin and Breesis.
Breesis, Heskin, this is High Priest Cragmound. King Runheim has been found dead in his private chambers. It appears he's been poisoned. Come home quickly.
Breesis and Heskin shared the message with the others, who stood amazed by what they'd just learned. "It's time to return home," Breesis said. "We need to find out what happened and attend the funeral." Everyone agreed without a moment of hesitation before setting off down the new road heading east. 2 days of travel went by before the signs and sounds of mourners flocking to Helmcar from all directions became evident. The group approached the massive outer walls of the dwarven port city once more, with guardsmen now standing shoulder to shoulder around the exterior, waiting in line that stood no less than a mile long to get their turn to enter the city and uncover the secrets that now lie within. Thank you again to all my awesome viewers and subscribers. I know this was a long series, but it was one of the only few mega dungeons that existed in Campaign 1, and the entire story had to be told. I can't wait to read your comments and hear your feedback about the episode. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and feel free to share this video. And of course, comment below with your favorite moment. One quick note before we sign off for today. I've moved the channel to 1 episode a week because 2 episodes a week had me rushing to finish the editing process, and I want to ensure that you get the best possible story content. Stay tuned as episode 5, The Last Laugh, will premiere next week. Until next time, my friends, be well and roll 20s.